It's very rare for something that's popular to remain within the media format that spawned it. More often than not, if something starts to take off in popularity, talks amongst corporate executives begin to start with how to turn even more of a profit off of it. As such, we start to see things that spawn into other forms of merchandise that have no connection to that original thing whatsoever, like toys, food, whatever this unholy abomination is. This is still relevant today, but it was notoriously prominent in the 80s and 90s, especially when it came to the concept of video games that were starting to reach a mainstream appeal and a home market. Western media companies were trying to figure out just how to turn a profit off of these weird intellectual properties that kids seem to enjoy so much, even if they didn't entirely understand why that was. As a result, every single popular video game started getting Western adaptations in the forms of movies and cartoons in an effort to appeal to the younger Western market that enjoyed the original games. And as you probably already know, a lot of this was of dubious quality. Regardless if you were a kid during those times and you saw something you recognized, you watched it. Hell, you probably even enjoyed it to some capacity. So let's take a trip down my own personal memory lane today. These are 3 video game cartoons that I watched growing up in no particular ranking or order. Why 3 and not say 5, the usual clickbait number of YouTube? Well, because we didn't get a lot of channels when I was a youngin'. That's why. Get off my lawn. When it comes to influential video games in the 90s, one of the most recognizable ones in the fighting genre is Capcom's Street Fighter. The series paved the way for a lot of other fighting games. It was even responsible for several clones that may have cropped up of it at the time. It's an influential, important part of video game history that's still going in the modern day, and yet I still don't think I've played or owned a single game from the series. The closest I've gotten are all the crossovers that the characters have had in other games. Anyway, due to its popularity in the 90s, it's only natural that Street Fighter would receive tons of expanded media outside of its video game incarnation. Thus, we had several Americanized adaptations, such as Street Fighter the Movie, which was based on the game, Street Fighter the Movie the Game, which was based on the movie, which was based on the game, Street Fighter the Movie the Game Home Edition, which was based on the game, which was based on the movie, which was based on the game, and Street Fighter the Animated Series, which is what we're talking about today. All these products had 2 things in common. They were westernized American retellings of Street Fighter, and they were awful. The cartoon came out a little under a year after the live-action movie did, and the premise for the show is as follows.
Colonel William Guile, one of the greatest martial artists in the world, travels the global tournament circuit, using it to conceal his top-secret mission as leader of an elite group of international crime fighters known only by their code name, Street Fighter.
Yep, it was the 90s, baby. We gotta sum it all up under a minute each week if we want this show to take advantage of syndication. This 26-episode show followed a basic cookie-cutter premise for each episode of Guile ending up in some random location, being contacted by his posh superior officer and given a mission to stop whatever zany scheme that M. Bison is conducting with the help of his fellow Street Fighters. The region that Guile was visiting at the time would often determine which character from the game joined him on his mission, since Street Fighter is all about that world tournament setting. But the most common recurring characters were still Chun-Li and Blanca, which allowed them to fill out your typical power trio setup with 2 guys and a girl. Or in this case, a guy, an inhuman sidekick, and a girl. Each episode had them go somewhere, beat up Bison who would run away cursing those Street Fighters, and then they all stand around and have a good laugh while occasionally reciting their code of honor and team handshake. Really, the only thing that was missing was the anti-drug 90s PSA at the end of each episode.
Stop all the downloading!
Now, as said before, I don't have a strong knowledge of Street Fighter despite watching this show and enjoying the so bad it's good live-action movie.
Fight with me.
Anyone who opposes me will be destroyed.
Colonel, you can't!
Oh yes, I can.
But I think anyone with even a passing glance of Street Fighter would know that something is off about this premise. For starters, why is Guile the main character here? Sure, he's iconic to the series and his theme goes with everything, but ask anyone and they won't tell you the main character of Street Fighter is the white guy with the impressive flat top. They'll say it's Ryu, or in this case, Ryu.
Ryu!
Yeah, there's the pot calling the kettle black in this case, but come on. The best reason I come up with for this would be the time that it was made and the audience it was being marketed towards, and other popular shows that they were clearly trying to emulate, like G.I. Joe. Guile is a true bleeds red, white, and blue American hero who loves his women wearing modest Y7 one-piece swimming suits and watching fireworks on the 4th of July. Ain't nothing about him that doesn't scream USA!
You know I hate guns. Guns are for wimps.
Okay, maybe one thing. Furthermore, the show used most of its characterization from the live-action movie that came out less than a year prior, so they're probably trying to stay consistent with what people would be familiar with in the popular media. Hence why Guile was the main character, why Chun-Li was a reporter instead of an Interpol agent, and why Ken and Ryu were con men opposed to just martial arts dudes. In the movie, Guile was the main hero, so it probably made sense to stick with him. Plus, given the show was going for the undercover special forces route, it also made more sense that Guile would be the person in charge of that. So it worked from a narrative point of view as well. At least with what this show's narrative was trying to be. And considering that at the time when this was made, that Street Fighter games had a pretty shallow story in general, they would have had to make some changes to stretch it out into a full series. Unfortunately, those changes still didn't help with it that much because Street Fighter the cartoon was still a pretty mediocre to bad product, with most of its problems stemming from the actual production. The show went through 2 different animation studios, which also meant the style changed drastically between certain episodes, but both studios went off model frequently, sometimes between 2 different shots back to back. Characters' bodies were constantly distorting and changing into weird shapes. There'd be bizarre close-ups on their faces for no reason that were supposed to be dramatic but came across as comical, and much more. A rather infamous clip from this show involves DJ running out of an elevator and seemingly shrinking as he moves around a dude attacking him. That's not how that works. The badness was the only entertaining parts of the show for me, but it wasn't enough to warrant a recommendation. The rest of the run was pretty forgettable and boring, to be honest. The voice actors did a good job, but the actual dialogue in the show was hammy, but not in a fun way. Instead came across as awkward most of the time. Characters from the game would just randomly show up for one episode or even one scene, even if it didn't make sense for them to be there, like when the Street Fighters go to E. Honda, the sumo wrestler, to have him hack a computer and find out where Guile is. Because that's something I guess he does when he's not sumo wrestling. Production costs seem to be different from episode to episode, making it so some episodes reuse stock footage much more often than others. The list goes on. Overall, Street Fighter cartoon was pretty forgettable and uninteresting. Unlike the live-action movie, which, while bad, was at least fun to watch. It's probably why the only thing people seem to remember from the show are the memes that came from it.
Yes! Yes!
So as I said back in my Mega Man Legends review, my exposure to the character of Mega Man was limited to spin-offs of the series. To this day, I had never played one of the original mainline Mega Man games, but instead have had experiences with other iterations of the character like Mega Man Volnut from Legends, Mega Man X from Mega Man X, and Saturday morning cartoon Mega Man. Like many other Capcom properties at this time, Mega Man was adapted into a Western cartoon, this one being multi-produced by Ruby Spears Production, Capcom, Ashi Productions, and Ocean Productions, though most people just refer to it as the Ruby Spears Mega Man show. The premise of the show followed how the games were set up in fairly broad strokes, although given the simplistic narrative of the original games, it wasn't that hard to screw up in the first place. Dr. Wily is an evil scientist who shows up once per episode with some zany schemes of megalomania and uses his evil robot masters to carry it out. So it's up to Mega Man, his robot dog Rush, his sister Roll, and his creator Dr. Light to take him down. Mega Man was an American 90s action cartoon in every fiber of its being. The dialogue was a hurricane of bad puns.
I hate to take the joy out of your joystick, Dr. Wily. You really got a charge out of that one.
Yeah! Show us your big, bad...
Every single character was extremely ripped. Casual sexism was abound.
I don't need any girl robots getting in my way.
I built this robot to handle household chores. Her name is Roll.
Now I'll have more time to concentrate on being a robo-hero.
No offense, Roll, but I think you better stick to your housework.
And every other episode ended in a joke or having the funny animal sidekick do something amusing. Like a lot of other cartoons from our childhoods, Mega Man was a show that I watched and enjoyed, but I didn't think about too critically when I was younger. Dr. Wily sets out to do something evil in each episode, and Mega Man has to stop him, but the foundation of that week-to-week plot starts to fall apart when you ask a simple, 3-letter question. Why?
My face will appear all over the city. I'm in control now. Nothing can stop me. Now, it's time for the mayor of the city to surrender!
Why?
But why?
Because it was man who should have gone extinct, not the dinosaur.
He's on Wily's team now.
Why? Don't get me wrong, it's not like the original games had super in-depth narratives or themes either. Just like a lot of video game cartoon adaptations of this era, there wasn't a lot of actual story or character writing to go on since these games were put onto a 200 kilobyte cartridge. So the writers had to fill in a lot of the blanks themselves. But even then, the reason for Dr. Wily's rampage in each episode was always just so outlandish and nonsensical. Eventually I started to realize that the writers were kind of just scripting their episodes around popular trends or what they thought might sell well if they could merchandise it to kids. Cowboys and saloons are cool, right? Kids like those? Well, let's have a meteor land outside a random old western town in a futuristic society. Hey, Jurassic Park is in. That made like $1 bajillion. Kids like dinosaurs now, so yeah, let's make a dinosaur episode. Outer space episode? Outer space episode? Oh, hell yeah, we're gonna have an outer space episode. And now this is touching on some of the really weird episodes, like when Dr. Wily unearths an ancient race of lion men in Hawaii who want to set out and turn the rest of the world into lion men like them. Band Pizza actually did a good review on this episode. You should check that out if you want to learn more. There was also some weird, unfortunate implications that the show put forward about the world of Mega Man that made me a little uncomfortable towards our heroes in particular. For example, robots in the world of Mega Man are more or less a sentient humanoid race, but are subjected to menial slave labor for all of humanity's needs and whims. And this is a pretty classic slave allegory that gets used in science fiction all the time, but Mega Man just sort of glazes over this. Robots very clearly have feelings and intelligence and a level of independence, but nobody seems to give a damn. The most jarring example was in episode 2, where Dr. Light is showing off his new cleaning robots at what really sort of comes across as a slave auction.
There's Dolores, the robo-nanny. She feeds and changes diapers in one easy operation. Then there's Morris, the robo-butler. He can pick out your clothes and doubles as a chauffeur. And finally, there's Doris, the robo-maid. She cooks and cleans and never complains.
But I don't do windows.
Well, almost never complains.
By the way, this character turns out to be a robot spy woman for Dr. Wily, and the gang not only end up dismembering her, but then they rebuild her into a personal slave for the dog. Well, we certainly won't hear any complaints coming from her anymore while she picks up Russia's nuclear dog poo. The animation for the show itself, though, was pretty good most of the time. There were a few points where it had a severe dip in quality or went off model, most notably in the infamous Curse of the Lion Men episode, but for the rest of the time, the animation and art weren't half bad. The entire opening sequence in particular looks awesome, and some of the fight scenes had some cool effects and clever moments. One of my favorite episodes was in Season 2, where Mega Man teams up with Mega Man X from the future to take on the Maverick's violent Spark Mandrill. X is actually drawn and animated in a much more anime-esque style compared to OG Mega Man, which really shows how he's time displaced, and overall, the episode was just cool and a lot of fun. I also like how the show actually does its best to incorporate elements of the original games into the series, and even some of the original Japanese material. Mega Man would absorb powers from the robot masters he was fighting and use their own weapons against them roughly once per episode, kinda like how you would earn a weapon for beating them in the game. Also, the show kept Mega Man's original name of Rock in the first episode when he sees his origins, even if he never goes by it for the rest of the series. The voice acting in the show also wasn't half bad, even if the script was incredibly silly. Scott McNeil was a prominent voice actor in this show, just like a lot of other 90s cartoon media, providing the voice of Proto Man and Dr. Wily. The show is actually the reason why so many people portray Dr. Wily with a German accent in fan works, due to McNeil's take on the character.
A beautiful sight, the complete destruction of Dr. Light, his stupid goody two-shoes robots, and their cozy little lab.
Mega Man himself was also voiced by Ian James Collett, who voiced a ton of other 90s cartoons along with Neil, and was the first voice actor for Goku in Dragon Ball Z's dub before Sean Schemmel took over. But it still only ended up running for 2 seasons, the third being canned due to budget restraints. It's a cartoon, folks. It's gotta live on merchandise, or the network won't bother to keep it around. So for this last cartoon, we're going to talk about a series that I don't think anyone under the age of 20 actually knows about, because it's an IP that's more or less ceased to exist in the public eye. Back in the mid-90s, computer games were starting to become all the rage now that it was easier and affordable to have a personal computer at your house that you could load games onto. One type of game that was popular during this period was the flight simulator. All kinds of games came out in that style. And in this category of game, there was one that really stuck out, called Wing Commander. Wing Commander was a series of popular spaceship flight simulators for the PC. It was a series set in the distant future of the 27th century, where humanity had perfected spaceflight and was now exploring the galaxy, where they would eventually become embroiled into a war with a race of warrior bipedal cat people known as the Killerratte. The series mostly followed the adventures of Christopher Blair, a pilot in the Confederation, who serves as a key player in humanity's war with the Killerratte. Wing Commander is an interesting franchise to me because it's one of those series that came out at an interesting crossroads for video game media in general. Even though the game has no more relevance in the modern day, back in the 90s, Wing Commander was kind of a big deal, and it's also kind of big how transformative each game was in its presentation. The game started as your typical run-of-the-mill spaceship sim where it was just shooty pew pew until you won. Your character didn't even have a canonical name back then before officially being named Christopher Blair in the third game. In fact, his surname Blair was actually sort of an inside joke with how the player character in the original game had blue hair. The third game was also when the series made the jump to full motion video like so many other computer games did during this era. And like so many other games, it wasn't always great. Everything took place in front of a green screen, so every set the characters interacted on looked really fake. Thankfully, they did tone it down significantly with Wing Commander 4, where they used more pre-built sets, so every cutscene looked like you're watching a scene from a high-production show like Battlestar Galactica or Stargate, or even a movie like Star Wars. And speaking of Star Wars, they got Mark freaking Hamill to play Blair in this game, and even had other big-name movie stars at the time like Malcolm McDowell as Admiral Tolwyn, your commanding officer, or Thomas F. Wilson as your wingman Maniac, or other roles with Christopher Walken, John Hurt, John Rhys-Davies, and more. And I know this may not mean much now, where famous people voice video game characters all the time, but guys, you gotta remember, this was the 90s. Video games didn't have artistic clout back then. The success of the games allowed Wing Commander to branch out into other media like trading cards, a movie starring Freddie Prinze Jr., and then of course the subject we're discussing today, a cartoon show. Wing Commander Academy was a cartoon show produced by Universal Cartoon Studios that ran on USA Network, along with some other video game cartoons like Street Fighter the series and Mortal Kombat Defenders of the Realm. In fact, there was even a crossover event that had some character called The Warrior King show up to drive the plot of a single episode for each series, to kinda tie the shows together in some weird USA Network cinematic universe, I guess. The show served as a prequel to the original Wing Commander game, with Blair, Maniac, and some other companions still at the Flight Academy while humanity's war with the Killerratte rages on in the background. After getting recognized by Commodore Tolwyn as having potential, Blair and his friends are recruited onto the ship, the Tiger's Claw, to continue the rest of their fighting. From there, they go on an adventure each week, meeting a host of weird alien creatures, constantly getting in dogfights, and fighting back against the Killerratte so that they may one day become the destined pilots that we know and love. Wing Commander Academy is a video game cartoon, but unlike the other video game cartoons on this list, there was something a bit different about it for me. It was actually unironically kinda good. Maybe it's because it was an intellectual property being adapted from a Western IP that already had plenty of lore, or maybe because the showrunners put a lot of effort in to try and keep with the original material. But Wing Commander Academy managed to avoid a lot of pitfalls that the other video game cartoons of this era had. For starters, although the show featured a new adventure every week and didn't run too tightly together as a series, there was still an overarching sense of continuity when it came to character writing. Characters would reference things that had happened in previous episodes, or maybe even have hang-ups over something that would shape their character development, like when Archer, the main female character, has to kill one of her fellow pilots when he loses his mind in order to save the Tiger's Claw from his suicide attack. This, plus the fact that this dude had confessed that he was in love with her earlier in the episode, shakes her up pretty bad for the rest of the series when it comes to taking a life. She eventually comes to terms with it, but it takes a while, as it naturally would. On that subject, it's kind of amazing to me how mature this show got despite who it was aimed at. Sure, it never got too graphic, we never saw someone die explicitly on screen, but Wing Commander Academy didn't shy away from the concept of death in war. Named characters with faces died almost every single week, and those deaths were often treated with real weight. It wasn't all doom and gloom, but Wing Commander Academy could be a pretty heavy show when it needed to be. Furthermore, the show managed to avoid the good and evil, black and white morality tropes that a lot of children's cartoon media like to use. Sure, the main Killerratte hierarchy were monsters, but there was a running theme of how the Confederation weren't all knights in shining armor either. Blair had a recurring inner conflict of wanting to find a way to solve the war peacefully. In an early episode, him and another pilot who used to serve as a Marine get stranded on a planet with the Killerratte, and the three of them have to put aside their differences to survive. It ends up going poorly as the Killerratte turns on them in the first chance it gets and ends up committing suicide by killer cuttlefish monsters rather than be taken prisoner or die by Blair's hands. But then in a later episode, Blair manages to legitimately convince the Killerratte to switch sides and assist the Confederation, but his superior officer doesn't believe it to be true, so they double-cross the Killerratte and wipe out him and his men. There was also an episode where a human scientist tried to inflict biological warfare on the Killerratte, an episode where the Killerratte revealed that they had been manipulating a primitive race into worshipping them as gods and giving them old weapons. There was a lot of moral ambiguity thrown around in this show. Of course, like most things, the show wasn't perfect, especially considering it was a cartoon in the 90s. The soundtrack for the show in particular was incredibly repetitive, and it got pretty boring pretty quick, especially when you're watching several episodes in succession like I did for this video. Also on the subject of the soundtrack, and it is possible that this was just the copy that I was watching, but the sound mixing in this show is really bad. Anytime action would start and the music would kick up, it was almost impossible to hear anything that anyone was saying.
Hey, these guys are...
On your way, sir.
Man, NASA didn't know what they were talking about. Space is noisy. But unfortunately, Wing Commander Academy was short-lived. It only ran for 13 episodes before its cancellation. Struck down too soon, I would say. In the end, Wing Commander itself would fade with time as well. After running for 5 main games and numerous spin-offs, the series has all but faded into obscurity. Kind of a shame, really. It was a decent series with some good entries. It wasn't all perfect, but it was solid. Except the movie, that thing kind of sucked ass.
Whatever turns you on, Wiley.